Esperamos unos minutos hasta que entren todas las personas y damos comienzo. Un segundito más. Bueno, bienvenidas, bienvenidos a la presentación del libro de Nicola Lacey, Estudios Críticos sobre Responsabilidad Penal y Política Criminal Comparada, publicado por Marcial Pons hace unas poquísimas semanas. Mi nombre es Alejandro Chehtman, soy profesor de la Escuela de Derecho de la Universidad de Itela y coeditor del libro junto con Íñigo Ortiz de Urbina, que es profesor de la Universidad Complutense de Madrid. Y Íñigo moderará la sesión luego de mis palabras iniciales. I'm going to switch into English. It's such a pleasure to launch a book that makes available to the Spanish-speaking legal community part of the work of Nicola Lacey, one of the most original and influential thinkers in contemporary criminal law theory, among other disciplinary fields. As you have not come to listen to me today, I'm going to keep my intervention very short and to the point. A note on how we will proceed. We will first hear from a fantastic group of scholars from the region. Professor Lacey will then address some of the comments and make any additional remarks as she may see fit. And during the last half an hour, we will welcome questions from the audience, so please write them down in the chat box. You can do that even during the presentations, and you can do that both in English and in Spanish. Íñigo will kindly translate those in Spanish into English, but that, of course, is at your peril. As I said, we have 4 fabulous commentators on the book, none of whom actually needs an introduction to this audience, but of course I need to introduce them nonetheless. Our first speaker is Julieta di Corleto. She has a PhD in history, and she's in charge of the Department for Continuing Legal Education at the Office of the Defender General of the Nation in Argentina. She's also associate professor at the University of Buenos Aires, an author of many interesting works, most notably her wonderful book, Malas Madres, Aborto, Infanticidio en Perspectiva Histórica. Second, we will have Roberto Gargarella. Roberto is one of the foremost public law and constitutional theory scholars in Latin America and one of the most interesting voices seeking to bridge conversations between criminal law, inequality, and democracy. He is professor of law at the Itela University and at the University of Buenos Aires. And he's, as you all know, a very prolific author. His works include The Legal Foundations of Inequality by Cambridge University Press, Latin American Constitutionalism, and his award-winning Castigar al Prójimo. Third, we will hear from Manuel Turale. He's associate professor of law at the University of Los Andes, Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, in Bogota, where he leads clinical work on prisons as well. He's, I think, one of the most interesting scholars in the intersection between criminal law and legal sociology in the region, and particularly has done incredibly interesting work on the political economy of punishment. He's the author of Castigo, Liberalismo Autoritario y Justicia Penal de Excepción, among many, many articles and works in leading journals. Fourth, Rocío Lorca Ferreccio. She's assistant professor at the Universidad de Chile. She co-directs the International Seminar on the Political Turns in Criminal Law Theory, and she works on questions of criminal law, inequality, as well as on the criminalization of poverty. Her work has appeared in leading journals in the world, such as the International Journal of Constitutional Law and the Canadian Journal of Law and Jurisprudence. And last, but certainly not least, Nicola Lacey is school professor of law, gender and social policy at the Department of Law at the London School of Economics. She is without any doubt one of the foremost criminal law theorists and legal scholars in the world, and she has written more than 10 books, including the award-winning biography of H.L.A. Hart, and most recently, In Search of Criminal Responsibility, ideas, interests, and institutions, as well as a large number of path-breaking articles. On top of that, she's an extraordinarily kind and generous scholar and a mentor to me and certainly to several others here. It is such a delight to finally have her work available in Spanish. I am convinced it will help raise new questions, open new lines of inquiry, and enormously enrich contemporary debates on criminal law theory in the region. I'm absolutely thrilled and grateful to all of them for joining us in this event. And without further ado, Julieta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. I'm supposed to speak in Spanish, right? It's in English. Okay, so I'm going to work this in progress. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very thrilled with this opportunity to talk with Nicola Lacey and with all who are here in the audience. I have 3 or 4 points to make about this book. To begin with, I would like to say that sometimes when we get to one book like this, we think that maybe we can find tough text or difficult to read. In this opportunity, in Estudios, Críticos, sobre Responsabilidad, Penal y Política Criminal Comparada, it's like a guide to Nicola Lacey thought production. And this is very important for us because it shows another way to think the criminal law. This book, it's far from making us think that law is like very coordinated ideas. The reflection that this author brings to us is prospective and retrospective. It takes us to the past. And in fact, this is the part that most of all interests me, because it let us think about the administration of justice in a more global or more complete idea. And it makes us think in order of dimension, a political dimension, an economic dimension, and a social dimension in a society. In one way, what this book is that shows us that law and society are not separate, and it makes us feel that we have to integrate our thoughts in this direction. We have certain questions that this book brings to us, and I would like to mark or to think of at least 2. The first one is how the book introduces in an intersection of history and sociology. And this is the way where the book takes us in a way that abandons the way we think here in most of, or in the academic in Argentina, the cases or the law studying case by case. This idea of thinking the case of abandoning the idea of showing the case by case analysis, it's not an easy work. And Nicola Lacey is not thinking this as something, as an instrument, or doesn't show us the law as an instrument of domination or an instrument of social control or an instrument for oppression. The thing is that she shows us the complexity of law. Why is that I'm so happy to have this book in Spanish? The first thing to say is that reading this book is really very pleasant. The content of the book is very powerful. The way it is translated is really brilliant. And for those who feel passion for studying the law outside the limits of the law, her work shows us a way, it stimulates us, and we feel or we want to read more. In a more personal sense, I would like to say that the work of Nicola Lacey comes to legitimate the work for those who are here in Argentina, and because of our interest in other disciplines, others like sociology or history, they tell us that what you do is not law. So here we have an academic which has no comparison in the region and the world, who is saying us, okay, this is a work that it is worth doing. So the book invites us to leave or to abandon these lectures that are closed, and it has an effect of healing the feelings of those who walk in the University of Buenos Aires feeling that we are not doing law. Against what the majority of lawyers, the media of the lawyers in our country think, Lacey shows us that history and that sociology, instead of being something static or boring, it makes us think more in a more interesting way. The law. Finally, I think that the work of Nicola shows us a lot of ways, the path that now we have to start. We're going to have a lot of difficulties in that journey. Here in Argentina, it is very hard to get to the archives, to get to the information that will keep us doing some legal history. And it is also very difficult to get the information and to get the statistics of how the law and the implementation of the law affects the society in general. In any case, it is an opportunity to start to thinking, or to start or to continue thinking about these things. And while we start working on that, I hope that Alejandro and Íñigo would start working in another book of Nicola Lacey to translate it in Spanish, so that we can keep on reading her and first of all, sharing all her knowledge with our students. I want to say that I've been reading your work since a very long time in the past. And here I have in this book, I have a lot of articles that they are wonderful. And I think one of my favorites, and the one who is already given to students to start to study here in Argentina, is La criminalización como regulación, el papel de derecho penal. I think that this article in particular is the one that broadens, or it allows us to start thinking the criminal law not as a very closed and separate sort of knowledge, and to integrate all the materials when we start thinking and teaching criminal law. So thank you very much for your work. Thank you very much to Alejandro and Íñigo that they prepared us a journey to your work, a journey that shows us all your thoughts, and this is really something to celebrate. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Julieta. That's great. Roberto?
Yes. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So yes, as Julieta said, for me it's also a pleasure, and here living in Argentina or in a Spanish-speaking country, was difficult to find your work translated, and this is an incredible opportunity. So the first thing I want to say is that this day is extremely important for the study of criminal law in Spanish. I have a few things to say about the work, and I wanted to make an effort to be critical about your work, but I had a problem, or two problems. One is that I always feel myself as an illegal immigrant or a foreigner in the criminal law, because I come from constitutional theory or political philosophy. And second is that I agree with most of the things you say. So I also read and admire your work. So it's not easy to think critically about your work. But let me make an effort just to mention a few things that I would like you to help us, Nicola, to help us thinking more thoroughly. These two comments, one is about the more normative or prescriptive part of the work that is included in the book, and the other is more related to the descriptive part of the work. About the normative, I want to take as an example, or as a primary example, the article on the clinical model. And about that, I first want to mention the numerous things which are for me extremely important, and that I just agree and admire from what you say and write. So I share with you from what you have written in the article, your critique of hard treatment, the critique of exclusionary measures, your distinction between punishment and blame, your emphasis on the importance of context, of history, of the empirical information, your emphasis on rehabilitation, your distinction between the persons and their actions, the emphasis you put on the importance of taking every person with equal respect and dignity, as Lorca said. Your critique of just desert, your critique of the re-emergence of rehabilitation, your emphasis on the fact that one can be both coming from a rotten background, and also to the very idea of the rotten background, and at the same time be considered responsible and called into account for what someone did. Or but I had a few differences, and I wanted to see how deep these differences, or how important they are, and also ask you about some, I wouldn't say omissions, but the lack of emphasis that you put in certain issues that I think are particularly important. So one initial, I don't know if it's a difference or if it's an important difference, but in that article you seem to somehow support forms of establishing punishment without blame. I would tend to emphasize the opposite, the importance of blaming without punishing. And I understand that the way you present punishment, so I mean, you take distance from hard punishment and exclusionary punishment, but the same, if we define punishment as hard did, as the deliberate imposition of pain or unpleasant consequences, well, I had a problem with that version of punishment, but I don't have a problem with blaming, and particularly, and this is more substantive point. Because I see the criminal law not as composed of, say, mala in se, but I see it as a whole result of social agreements, of in a way, democratic agreements. And so, for me, a democratic society has the right to decide collectively what behaviors are going to be reproached. And in that sense, for those who break the limits, if and only if those limits are being established collectively and are the product of a profound social agreement, then we can perfectly blame someone, blame this person effectively, and I see no problem with that. But the fact that, I associate the criminal law with a democratic agreement suggests, at least to me, that the model of the clinical model, runs the risk of diverting our attention to the social. So the clinical model, in a way, forces us or move us to put more attention on the individual, on the psyche of the psyche of the individual. And if you want, we can go back and see, well, his, her family relations. And if we are more, consequent, and this is also your case, and that's totally fine, we can say, well, we see how this person emerged from this society, and so we trace back. But in a way, it doesn't put in the center the social. So in my view, the clinical model, even though I take most of the implications you take, and I subscribe most of the theses that you derive from that model. But I take it from a different model, which is the model of the social compact and the democratic agreement. And for me, that democratic agreement, that the social compact, puts at the very center what needs to be at the very center, which is the social. So in a way, the clinical model, for me, even though, as I said, I take all the theses that you derive from it, run the risk of diverting our attention from what is, for me, crucial, which is the social. So in that sense, it's problematic. But together with this, I would say, and this is a general comment about your work, which is, and this also has to do with my own inclinations, with my own academic preferences, if you want, but also my convictions, which is, for me, the criminal law needs to be, I'm sorry, to be intimately linked with democracy, and that aspect, democracy, is not at the center of your work. As I said, you coming from a concern with the social and a different perspective, arrive to conclusions that I would share in most occasions. But for me, seeing all those broad agreements that, in a way, we have, it's surprising that the democracy is not at the center. And also, in a way, even though, you make distinctions concerning democracy, which are important for me, because, for example, a few times in the book, I see your references or your distinction between democracy and democracy that is more emphatic in the deliberative aspect, in the dialogic aspect. So that, in a way, is my approach to democracy. And in a way, I see that there is a risk that people reading your work do not see what I think you are implicitly or sometimes explicitly emphasizing, which is the importance of relating democracy with a collective discussion, which is not just, I mean, what majority rule says at one single moment. So someone could say, okay, democracy is a problem. As many criminal law theories says, well, democracy is a problem. Why? Because, well, people want punishment and they just want to create more, I mean, I don't know, to accuse people and to put people in prison. And so if we establish a link between majority rule and criminal law, what we have is an explosion of punishment, and we don't want to say that, and you don't say that, but in that sense, I don't see first democracy at the center of your concerns, even though you make the distinction that I think are necessary to make, just not to identify democracy as what a survey poll or a majority opinion says at one single moment. So the point is that the clinical model, even though I tend to agree with all the consequences you take from it, you derive from it, run the risk of diverting our attention from the social agreement and, I would say, the deliberative democracy and the importance it has for thinking better about the criminal law. So from this different perspective, as I said, I get to the same conclusion that you got. So I ask you about the place of democracy, and particularly a robust deliberative democracy in your view. Now let me put this aside and go to the second and final point, which is more related to the descriptive part of your work. There I am much less an expert, although I developed a similar empirical studies during the 90s, for example, related to the relevance of the electoral system in the US and the relevance of federalism in the US and the relevance of the weak party discipline in the US in order to explain different things. I was working at that time in a research center which was conducted by Carlos Nino and Genaro Carrillo, which yes, I mean, that it was wonderful to see the importance of Carrillo in your book on heart, but yes, Carrillo was a super wonderful, incredible, amazing person. And well, in that center, at that time, Carrillo was very old and he was quite depressed. But well, at that center, we developed certain empirical studies, but in order to distinguish the US presidentialist model from the model of presidentialism that was dominated in Latin America. And in a way, we were making all those distinctions in order to show the weaknesses and the problems and the, I don't know, all the horrible things that derived from our system that concentrated authority in one single president, which was super powerful, with concentrated authority. So in a way, it's not that I fall in love with that model of weak party systems, radical decentralization, uninominal electoral system, but I tended to link those political decisions or political choices with a more moderate, less authoritarian political system and also criminal law system. So we were thinking it from the perspective of the political system and Latin American authoritarianism. But I would say from our studies, although the criminal law developments were not at the center of our attention, but I think that we made some connections between the Latin American system that was non-federalist, centralist, in a way authoritarian, or democratic, but with a very strong executive authority, we link that with the growth of punishment, the levels of imprisonment. So in a way, you make your comparison, in those texts, you make your comparison with, say, Scandinavian countries, or so, which are more equal, which has less levels of poverty and less level of inequality. But when I take, so what is similar with the US and Latin America? Well, what I would say is the levels of poverty and inequality. So in a way, this is to say that paying attention to the same political choices that you pay attention in the US, I would say, well, maybe they have, they are together with these horrible consequences in the criminal law, but it made me think, when I take the perspective of Latin America, that, well, we shouldn't, establish such a strong correlation between those elements and the increase in the number of punishment or people in jails. But I would, in a way, would go back to the more traditional association with, well, the problem is poverty and inequalities. So I don't know. So my idea would be, would it help your work to pay attention to systems like those in Latin America, which in a way show that the problems are very similar to those in the United States, even though they have the opposite choices in terms of electoral system, in terms of centralization, in terms of the strength of the executive, etc., etc. So I would, in a way, tend to stay with the old, more traditional explanation. So relating those levels of imprisonment and punishment with poverty and inequality. And also, in a way, it helped me, and with this I finish, to accommodate more my intuitions, because I tend to see, decentralization and community, well, more as virtues than as defects. And in a way, Niels Christie's dream was the dream of a super decentralized society with a strong community. So well, in that way, I wonder whether studying, the Latin American system that distinguish from the US system precisely in those aspects wouldn't help you to rethink the importance of those elements in explaining the growth of the levels of imprisonment and the levels of punishment, etc. So just I wanted to make these 2 points, one more normative, one more descriptive, but just as an excuse to what is really important, which is a super celebration of having your work in Spanish. So thank you. And thank you for the organizers and those who made this possible, which is really wonderful.
Thanks a lot, Roberto. And Julieta, we duly noted your request for a second book. We'll talk about that later. Now, Manuel, the floor is yours.
Hello, Alejandro and Íñigo, thank you for inviting me to this event. I'm really glad to be part of it, especially because it honors the work of Nicola Lacey, which is not only a great scholar, but a fantastic human being. And I know that by experience, because I met her now a long time ago in 2000 when I was doing my LLM at the LSE. And then when I did my PhD at the LSE, I had the great luck of having Nikki as my tutor. So part of what I am now, right now as a scholar and as a person, I owe it to Nikki. So I'm really glad to be part of this event. Well, I would like to briefly consider two different topics Nicola Lacey has approached during her fruitful academic career and which are included in the book we are discussing today. I find these topics particularly compelling as a scholar formed under the strict structures and principles of the legal profession in Latin America, but who has developed a keen interest in the broader and more interdisciplinary perspectives that criminology and the sociology of punishment provide. These are disciplines that, I must stress, I came to know and love during my postgraduate studies at the LSE under the inspiring guidance of Nicola Lacey. The first topic relates to the often overlooked constitutive relationship between criminal law and criminology. These disciplines tend to be artificially disconnected, ignoring that they are historical constructions that deal with the fundamental problem of criminalization of human conduct. In Latin America, such artificial division is even more problematic than in many global north countries, for criminology has not been able to develop as an autonomous discipline with strong links to the social sciences. Instead, it has been regarded, in the best of cases, as an appendix of criminal law, which criminal lawyers and scholars undertake almost as a hobby in their spare time. In her article, Criminalization, Historical, Legal, and Criminological Perspectives, written with Lucia Zedner, and included in the book that is being launched today as the chapter Criminalización, Perspectivas Histórica, Jurídica y Criminológica, Lacey and Zedner compellingly remind us what every criminal lawyer, criminal law scholar, and criminologist ought to know right from the start. That criminal law and criminology are enterprises tied to a historical, political, economic, social, and cultural context that construct the concept of crime and the practice of criminalization. In this sense, criminology is not an appendix of criminal law, the hobby of criminal lawyers, but rather a pivotal aspect to grasp the reach and limits of criminalization and of criminal law. The second topic I would like to highlight is what may be termed the comparative political economy of punishment, to which Nicola Lacey has made a fundamental contribution and which has been a central aspect of my research. During the last 2 decades, there has been an important academic debate on how socioeconomic structures and cultural changes have conditioned Western democracies' responses to the problem of crime. Late modern societies, more individualistic and exclusionary than their predecessors of the welfare state era, tend to resort to more punitive and stigmatizing criminal policies to impose social order. These have led to a widespread expansion of penalty, mainly measured as a significant increase in imprisonment rates. But even if this may be the case in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, this trend may not be so easily extrapolated to other democratic regimes, which have responded to the crime problem in very different ways. Therefore, the causes of this change are not all the same. The work of Nicola Lacey has been instrumental in raising critical questions about the utility of comprehensive causal explanations and categories to explain complex and varied phenomena. Lacey has proposed a shift of focus from a broad cultural explanations of epochal changes and social attitudes towards crime to more grounded and evidence-based political and economic analysis that take into account institutional variables that have substantial effects on the specific penal outcomes of different jurisdictions. According to Lacey, macrocomparative studies on the political economy of criminal justice systems tend to focus on what she calls the cultural sociology of political economy, which revolves around issues such as feelings, attitudes, dispositions, and perceptions about crime, political, economic, and social changes, which nevertheless are essential variables to be considered, rather than focusing on the deeper structural and institutional conditions that engender them. In this way, Lacey proposes a different and original path, namely a more detailed analysis of the penal state and the institutional structures, dynamics, and dispositions present in every jurisdiction, which directly impact penal policy and outcomes. This more detailed, in-depth approach to comparative studies of the political economy of punishment in different democratic systems focuses on economic, political, and social institutions, as well as on different types of electoral systems and the structure of the welfare state. Lacey's research in this area is broad and has evolved during recent years. I would like to highlight two working categories of comparative institutionalist analysis derived from the varieties of capitalism that Lacey has constructed and which are fundamental to study different contexts. On the one hand, coordinated market economies, which offer more incentives for the relevant decision makers to opt for more inclusive and less punitive criminal justice systems. On the other hand, liberal market economies, which, being more individualistic and less cooperative, tend to find that it's more cost-effective to uphold exclusionary and harsh forms of criminal justice than would be the case in coordinated market economies. Lacey argues that this perspective fits and complements the typologies offered by more general theories. Thus, social democratic and, to a lesser degree, corporatist systems are coordinated market economies, while neoliberal systems are liberal market economies. In liberal market economies, coupled with majoritarian democracies, where the winner takes all, high social anxiety and fear of crime, together with low confidence in the state's ability to deal with these problems, put political pressure on state institutions to reassure the public. They become more sensitive to public opinion and less autonomous, less technical and more politicized, and thus the will of the majority dictates choices between alternatives. In these circumstances, elections become crucial for deciding which penal policies are to be implemented, and those in charge of them become more conscious of the need to win the voters' favor. This is the case in the United States and the United Kingdom. On the other hand, consensus democracies prioritize political participation over majorities. They seek compromises between different parties and coalitions. This results in more moderate and restrained penal policies and practices, which are also more stable, for they do not depend on what a majority decides during each election. Therefore, under these conditions, the penal state tends to have more autonomy. It is more insulated from public opinion and may rely more on the technical advice of experts. This is the case in Scandinavian countries and Western European countries with corporatist regimes, or cooperative market economies with proportionally representative electoral system, as Lacey remarks. From this groundbreaking perspective, deployed in her seminal book, The Prisoner's Dilemma, Political Economy and Punishment in Contemporary Democracies, which I think also should be translated into Spanish, Lacey has developed further research into particular features of democratic regimes and societies, such as the United States, England and Wales, Scotland, and New Zealand, which may help to explain in a more detailed and sophisticated way their particular responses to the crime problem, thus showing the importance of comparative studies as well as the limits of all-encompassing typologies that pretend to explain very different phenomena in simplistic causal terms. This is apparent in two of the chapters we are discussing today. Thus, in the chapters Political Systems and Criminal Justice, The Prisoner's Dilemma After the Coalition, Sistemas Políticos y Justicia Penal, El Dilema del Prisionero después de un gobierno de coalición, and Why are the truly disadvantaged American when the UK is bad enough? ¿Por qué los verdaderos desfavorecidos son estadounidenses cuando el Reino Unido ya es bastante malo? Written with David Soskis, Lacey explores the ways in which the institutional structure of political systems shapes the politics of criminal justice. On the one hand, through the study of the decentralized institutional structure of the US political system, Lacey and Soskis assess its impact on the US unparalleled levels of crime and punishment. On the other hand, Lacey analyzes coalition governments in England, Scotland, and New Zealand to establish whether coalition politics may facilitate stability and moderation in criminal justice policies. I think all these topics are very relevant to study the Latin American case, and following Roberto's suggestion, I would encourage Nikki to apply this kind of analysis to the Latin American context to broaden the comparative studies she is developing. Finally, I enjoyed reading these chapters again, finally in Spanish, thanks to the impeccable translations and the careful editing process undertaken by Alejandro and Íñigo. Thus, this book finally pays, at least partially, a long-standing and outstanding debt to grant access to Spanish and Latin American audiences to the work of one of the most brilliant and influential scholars of our time in the subjects of criminal law, legal theory, criminology, and the political economy of punishment. Thank you, Alejandro, Íñigo, and of course, Nikki.
Many thanks, Manuel. Some of the translators are in the audience, so thanks to them, Gustavo among them. Now it's the turn of Rocio. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Alejandro, and thank you, Íñigo, for the invitation, and thank you, Nicola, for making this possible together with Íñigo and Alejandro. So it's a great honor for me to be among this group today to offer some words. In my case, it will just be words of praise, not critical. And I would like to speak about two things. First, I want to share some reasons why I think this book is so important for us, for Latin Americans. And second, I want to say something brief about why I think this book is so important for us today. So on this book, importance. The new big thing in Chilean academia, which has been promoted by the agencies that manage the research grants, is multidisciplinary work or transdisciplinary work. However, legal scholars in Chile are just starting to create something like our own legal academia. Not so long ago, it was very hard for us to have a full-time job in academia and make a living out of researching and teaching. And just as soon as we managed to validate academia as part of what lawyers can do, they ask us to go beyond the borders of legal thought and create transdisciplinary or multidisciplinary teams to advance knowledge. Now, this requirement is particularly hard for criminal law scholars because we had very successfully convinced everyone that it is not the business of the legal scholar to study crime from empirical, sociological, historical, or any other discipline than legal philosophy or the law itself. Our business is supposed to be to offer a rational reconstruction of our criminal laws. And of course, we do this because we do this in isolation. We often find ourselves a bit frustrated. What rationality is out there? There seems to be none. So in this context of isolation and disillusionment, the reason why this book is so important for us is that it shows that traveling across the borders of disciplines and perspectives is worth the effort. Lacey's scholarship shows that traveling across these borders can allow us to do some important things. Let me mention some. It allows us to see and understand the rationality of our criminal law practices, even when they do not meet our expectations. It allows us to interrogate our practices and imagine new possibilities by looking at them from many different places. It shows that in order to better understand and perhaps redesign a practice or an institution, categories can be developed and must be developed in a way that creates spaces of communication among disciplines. And perhaps more importantly, the scholarship of Nicola Lacey and the works collected in this particular book show that a border-crossing approach to crime is fundamental to make a constructive critique of our criminal law practices. In the context of critical thinking, one thing I find particularly valuable of Lacey's work is that it goes beyond unveiling disguised aspects of our practices, or also goes beyond questioning their foundations and our commitments. She also often offers new ways and new productive ways of seeing things. It gives us, so to speak, a place to be, and it provides good reasons to move toward these other places. As this book exemplifies, borders can be crossed and are crossed by Lacey's work in different ways. I will mention some. First, borders can be crossed by thinking about crime and criminal law policies from theoretical frameworks that have not been paradigmatically interested on crime policy. Her chapter on political system and the prisoner's dilemma is an example of this, where she explored penal policies from the point of view of political economy and political theory, challenging popular narratives about punitivism by showing how the institutional design of political systems have an influence on penal policies. Another example of bringing a completely foreign discipline to think about crime is her work with Hannah Pickard, where she examines fundamental categories of the criminal law from the lens of clinical science. I will come back to this a little later. A second way in which these works show how borders can be crossed is by crossing borders among disciplines that do study crime, but from different perspectives. In Spanish, we usually call ciencias penales a set of disciplines that is composed by legal theory, criminology, and criminal policy. And what these works show is that these disciplines should come together, right? An example of this kind of communication is the communication she builds between legal and criminological conceptions of crime. Her work shows how the doctrinal and policy work that criminal law scholars and theorists sometimes do could gain by strengthening the communication with a criminological approach. An approach of this kind is, however, a big challenge for us, for criminal law theorists, and especially for a legalistic ethos, as it proposes that crime is not just an individual action, but also a social event that has a relevant political, economic, and cultural context. From the space of legal theory, bringing context to a criminal trial seems dangerous. We worry this could come at the cost of impartiality and certainty. But Lacey's knowledge of legal philosophy and criminal law theory shows that our legal building need not collapse because we add some reality and context into it. Quite the contrary, adding context or reality can give more consistency and stability to our legal categories and bring their results closer to the demands of justice. Lacey urges us to see that criminology is well equipped to contribute in giving context to the criminal law, and legal theorists should be able to find ways of incorporating context without falling prey to the abyss of discretionary and arbitrary decision-making. Another border, and this will be the last I will mention here, that is crossed in Lacey's work is what we may call internal borders of criminal law legal theory, where apparent dilemmas or conflicts among legal principles are brought into question. I would like to exemplify this by considering her work on the idea of responsibility without blame. Here it seems to me, Lacey shows that a long-held internal border between prevention and culpability need not stand so firmly. Together with the principle of legality, nothing is more important for us than the idea of culpability. For us, I mean legal scholars. The classic antagonist for a criminal law practice based on individual responsibility has been preventive theories of punishment, and particularly rehabilitation, which seems to push us into a criminal law practice based on dangerousness. Criminal law scholars worry that shaping our practices to serve rehabilitation will open too much space for state authoritarian intervention and will deprive offenders of their agency. However, in the idea of responsibility without blame, Lacey offers another possibility. Maybe we can have it all. The idea proposes that it is possible to recognize others as agents and hold them accountable for their actions without having to resort to what she calls, together with Hannah Picard, affective blame. In affective blame, responsibility seems to demand that we validate and are ready to show attitudes that create suffering and stigma. These attitudes undermine the possibility of rehabilitation and promote quite indecent forms of treating each other. However, they have long been seen as necessary to recognize each other as responsible agents. So we are in a sort of a dilemma. We don't want to have these terrible practices, but if we don't do this, if we don't engage in these reactive attitudes, we can't really recognize the agency of offenders. But Lacey and Picard suggest persuasively, to my view, that there is no dilemma between holding each other responsible and treating each other with respect and compassion. We can hold people accountable in a way that is not detrimental to the possibility of rehabilitation. And this can have an important impact, I believe, on the ways in which we understand the practice of holding each other responsible through the criminal law. So why is this book so important for us today? Of course, good scholarly work such as this is always important as a matter of knowledge, but it is not always equally important as a resource for social and institutional change. Since I belong to a country that has been said to be awakened and is now starting a conversation about a new social and political arrangement, this kind of work seems particularly important for us and for me today. It shows that there is a space to re-examine our commitments and imagine new possibilities for criminal justice. And it also offers some specific ideas of what these possibilities may look like. We may take them or not in our conversation. What matters is that we consider that there is a space for institutional imagination and design. So it makes me extremely glad that such a collection of Lacey's work will now be available in Spanish, because it is sure to alter the current content, at least of my criminal law syllabus. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rocio. Nikki, I think we've all been waiting to hear.
Thank you all so very, very much. I'm not going to be able to do justice to all of your comments in the sort of 10 to 15 minutes I'm going to take, because I do want to leave space for some questions from the audience. But what a wonderful set of comments. And let me just start by reiterating my incredible, deep gratitude to Alejandro and Íñigo and everybody who's been involved in preparing this collection. It's really honestly like a dream come true for me to have my work translated, especially into Spanish, because as has become apparent in what we have to discuss with each other, and also I was so glad, Roberto, that you mentioned Cario and Niño, because these are figures from my long past engagements with jurisprudence. There's always been this particular sort of special relationship between the English speaking and the Spanish speaking academy. I have to say, fostered by your linguistic competence and generosity, as exemplified today by all of you working in your second language, and me in in the minority working my first language. So I think that's incredible generosity, and it has a big intellectual payoff. And I've also, of course, been very, very lucky to have a whole number of students from Spain and Latin America, various Latin American countries over the years, including Manuel. 2 of my 4 doctoral students at the moment are respectively from Colombia and from Spain. I've examined many theses, and I've learned so much from particularly, I would say, my Latin American students over the years, which has really made me feel very, very acutely the sort of limitations of the theoretical frameworks that I use to build the prisoner's dilemma in particular, which are, of course, very much built on sort of assumptions around global north countries with a few southern tiny exemplars like Australia and New Zealand. So, I think, and I'll come back to that when I try to respond to Manuel's and Roberto's points. So, this is very special for me as well, and I'm really moved and excited that you all think it's going to be useful to scholars and students across the region. And I think that is particularly useful, potentially, I hope, in terms of opening up the potential for further intra-Latin American comparative scholarship, as well as having Latin American countries or the region as a comparative focus for work on the US, both of which Manuel has already contributed to in some of his work. I think this is going to be actually one of the big developing fields in the next few years. So I'm just really delighted that if my work can in any way contribute to that, that's just fabulous for me. I'd like to try and say something about what each of you said, but I'm going to try and do it thematically rather than go through each of your comments, because I think that there are some themes that come out across more that each of you have raised, or most of you have raised. And the first one, which I think comes out particularly strongly from Julieta's and Rocio's comments, is this business about border crossing and how we can go about wearing down the boundaries which are inimical to really a full understanding of the social world within which law and criminal justice systems are embedded. And I always, through my career, I have been very much driven by questions I wanted to answer. And then I love this idea of that you introduced, Roberto, being a sort of illegal a refugee in some other field. I've been a refugee all my life because, unfortunately, although I can tell you, and I'm sure you've all been the same, there have been moments when I felt overfaced by my own, appetite for border crossing, and just wished I'd been born the kind of person who liked writing standard law review articles. But of course, I didn't really ever mean that, because all the interesting questions, it seems to me, do require us to cross those boundaries. And I've been incredibly lucky, because when I started out, when I was a student at University College London in the 1970s, things were very much as you're all describing them being in your jurisdictions. In other words, law was very much a sort of law school phenomenon. A lot of the teachers were primarily practitioners, and you could definitely get punished for thinking too critically behind the bicycle sheds. So it's moved enormously over the last 30 years, and people like me and all of you have been beneficiaries of that sort of opening up of the boundaries within law studies, the sort of re-evaluation of socio-legal studies, law and society work, the place of criminology, the place of history, of properly comparative studies, not just of legal doctrines, but of legal institutions. But I would just like to say, because it sounds as though you're beginning to see those sorts of developments in your countries, and I think they need to be vigorously defended, because they're under threat in my jurisdiction at the moment. And they're under threat for very basic institutional reasons, which have to do with the incentive systems set up by government to regulate the market that government has created in higher education. So we got our market freedoms, and as usual, it came along with a whole lot of state regulation in the form of research evaluations, which have solidified one of the most sort of toxic things about academic world, and one of the enemies of border crossing, which is hierarchies of journals. And we know that that's a big problem in economics, in philosophy. It hasn't been a big problem in law, but it's beginning to become one. And so we must all sort of vigorously defend, I think, this practice of border crossing, without which we aren't going to be able to answer the big questions that is, what the academy is for. Of course, it's all about basic research and just understanding, but we all, particularly those of us who work on politics or criminal justice, we tend to be motivated by normative and political aspirations of one kind or another, and we want our work to be able to contribute and make a difference. So I think that's a really crucial thing. And I do think in terms of the different sorts of borders, which you very much drew attention to, Rocio, the use of, and again you mentioned this, Julieta, that the importance of looking at things in a longer historical frame perspective, or of looking at things comparatively, is also a really important way of getting beyond our parochial view of things. We all can fall into the assumption that things are just, as they've always been, or as they are near us. And I think it's that sort of intellectual border crossing that historical scholarship and comparative scholarship can enable, that is really so exciting and potentially fruitful. So having said that, I'd like to come on to, I'm going to sort of center the rest of my comments on, I think, on these two critical points that Roberto made, but I'm going to pick up because they themselves connect with some of the points that the rest of you made. So let me take the normative one first. The work with Hannah on responsibility without blame. Now, to some extent, the motivation here is a sort of empirical one on which I think the evidence is very difficult to interpret, and we might just, Roberto, have different intuitions on this. But Hannah's and my very strong sense, and hers is much more shaped by her own experience in the clinic, because she's a very interesting combination of an analytic philosopher and somebody who's done a lot of group work, mainly with people with enormously complex social backgrounds and an intimate relationship with the criminal justice system. And her thought, and it's really very much the motivation behind our our work was that you can't keep stigma out of affective blame. So as soon as you accept that criminal justice is in the business of blaming in that sense, then you get into the difficulty that Rocio, I very much like the way you put it, Rocio, that I hadn't really thought about it in these terms before, that what we were trying to do is sort of get rid of what we see as a sort of artificial choice that you have to have between responsibility or culpability and prevention. By arguing that you can't have, is that actually responsibility and agency are very key to how you work with people to effect behavioural change and prevent crime, but you have to do them together, and you have to keep negative affects out of the courtroom as of the clinic. So I think I stick with that intuition, but I want to make a really important concession to your criticism, which I think is very, very well taken, and something that I myself have been working towards, funnily enough, as a result of work on the latest paper Hannah and I have just published, in which we took up the debate, there's a big debate at the moment about so-called standing to blame in criminal law, and whether the state loses standing when it doesn't do things about the education system or the housing system to correct the social effects, which you're quite rightly drawing attention to. And I think that I take your point that the clinical model and that the language of the clinic does invite a much more individualistic analysis. I don't think we meant it that way, because I think Hannah's conception of her clinical practice is very socially rooted. But I do think, and we've come to this conclusion, to the point of Hannah actually saying to me, yeah, but I'm not a political philosopher. And I said, no, tough, we're going to have to go there, because actually when we did the Standing to Blame article, we realized that the argument we really wanted to make was about the relationship between punishment and democracy, and the thought that yes, there are limits to the authority of the state to call to account, as Anthony Duff would say it, if injustice is so deeply rooted. But that really is a question of political authority that you can't just neatly bracket off into standing. And so I think through a longer and more indirect journey, I too have come back to the conclusion, that sort of takes me back to some of my very early work, that political theory is going to have to be very much part of how we develop this model if we're going to develop it further, which I hope we will. I'm really grateful to Hannah, as Lucia and David, for letting me include it in the collection. And then the descriptive, the explanatory, the comparative, which also ties up very much with what Manuel was talking about. I very much take the point that the question of what we compare is of the greatest consequence, and also actually methodologically very poorly understood. I think there's a lot more work to be done in comparative social science quite generally about how we decide and manage the inevitable limitations of any particular comparison. You can't answer every question, you can't illuminate every question through one particular comparison. So there are always limits to comparative work, but I think they can be made more manageable through a more sort of reflexive praxis, if you like. I think you're absolutely right that if you looked closely at an Latin American comparison, then you would see crucial differences between differently structured presidential systems, and in particular the openness of certain very centralized systems to authoritarianism has got to be a major explanatory variable in any account of how criminal justice develops. I totally take that point. We never meant, although you know what it's like when you've got a new argument, it's like a shiny new thing, and you put it as strongly as you can because you want to sort of test it out. I don't think we ever meant to suggest that the American political system was sort of determinative of these outcomes. But I would very much hold to the idea that the particular form of radical decentralization in America. And if I were going to pull out one particular issue, it would be the way in which that has shaped the organization of space in America, and the sort of incredibly, really unique to an advanced democracy of racial segregation, radical poverty and race-based segregation. And just in terms of putting things on the agenda for translation, not mine. I think Manuel was part of a project which David and two other colleagues and I put together a sort of fabulous edited collection. I can say that because it's mainly other people's work than mine, including a wonderful paper on Latin America by Manuel. But there's a fabulously interesting paper, I think, by Lisa Miller, which I think I footnoted in my introduction to this book, called American Exceptionalism, or the Exceptionalism of the Americas. And she draws attention to another thing, not so much just poverty and violence in themselves, and I agree those are terribly important, and inequality, but she talks in particular about the ways, the sort of broad analogies between the ways in which, on the one hand, the history of slavery in the US, and on the other hand, the history of colonialism across the region of Latin America, sort of fractured the process of state formation in ways that just basically failed to include certain very large groups in anything like a reasonable way, and that the problems that has then led to. So, you know, I think there are just, these questions are so complicated, aren't they? But I want to, on the one hand, I stick with the point that Manuel was emphasizing. I do think that differently constituted political systems, as you were thinking in your earlier work, set up sort of stably different opportunities and incentives, but they aren't the only thing that shapes how outcomes come. And you know, clearly what happened to the world economy, for example, in the 1970s was a huge part of what happened to criminal justice in pretty much every country. So listen, I just feel I must stop in order to leave some time for the audience, but I would just love to go on talking about all the interesting points you've made. And can I just say, I mean, thank you again. And it's just amazing to find it's completely obvious from what you've all said, to find my work so incredibly well understood, and even to find you seeing things in it I didn't see myself. So I think you've all been incredibly generous. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Nicola. It is my turn now to moderate after the catastrophes that Alejandro has brought upon us. I don't know whether there is anybody who wants to take the floor, anybody from the audience. If they want to, they can just, you know, take it. And if they don't, then I will pose my very deep and interesting question.
You guys, I think there's one in the chat.
Yeah.
Is there? I'm not seeing it.
Hello, Patricia. Thank you for your lovely, your lovely message. There's a question from Fernando Braccaccini. So question, shall I read it? Because I can see it. This is a question for Professor Lacey. I'm very interested in the idea of responsibility without blame in particular. I wanted to ask you how you think we should proceed in cases in which rehabilitation does not seem to be necessary, i.e. the offender is not likely to reoffend. Still, should we still use criminal law to respond to wrongdoing? I'm curious because it seems that it would still be valuable to react by expressing condemnation of the offender for her offence through criminal law as a way of reaffirming victims' dignity. I'd appreciate it if you tell us how the clinical model would work in such a case. So thank you so much for that, that excellent question, Fernando. I think the answer is we wouldn't at all rule out a criminal conviction. And this, I think, very much relates back to the question that Roberto was asking about, you know, don't we agree that criminal law is about enforcing standards that have been produced through democratic agreement, ideally, you know, that it is about things that we don't want to happen, and we say, no, that shouldn't have happened, and you want to call that wrongdoing, that's fine by me. I think I've perhaps overreacted in my language by, you know, being very much involved, as some of you are, in the so-called sort of political turn in criminal law theory. I'm trying to avoid the language used by the legal moralists. But of course, you know, criminal law is by definition about things that society disapproves in some sense, doesn't want to happen, doesn't want to be repeated. And so I do see the meaningfulness of, you know, a formal conviction and a statement of conviction, but I don't think that has to involve punishment in the traditional sense. And you know, there I find myself in good company with my old friend Professor Hart, who was, of course, always concerned to separate the concept of law from the concept of sanction, and I think that's really important for criminal law. Mm-hmm. So thanks for the question.
Thanks to you, Nicola. Anybody else? Okay. Let me follow up on what you just said, you know, that you try to avoid the language by legal moralists, because, you know, this is a point where I depart from Roberto and from you. You know, when you say you don't like to use the term just desserts, and you don't really like a lot to talk about fairness, and I love it. And not precisely just desserts, because I know you know, the expression is tainted by now, you know, because of what happened, you know, using that name, you know, those politics, you know, that happened, especially in the US in the 70s and early 80s under that name. But, you know, I think that we are just giving too much, you know, to the legal moralist when we avoid this kind of language, which is a language that everybody could easily understand. And we just have to take it away from people who understand that dessert is about being a Kantian and total idealistic theoretical person, and thinking of the desert of non-human beings who are perfect and can just decide, you know, completely free at any moment in any situation. If we were able, you know, to just in a sort of Gallen-Strawson way, you know, to go and show people, you know, look, you are born with a certain genetic makeup which you haven't decided upon. Actually, your parents decided, you know, 9 months before your birth, you know, that they were gonna at least take the risk, you know, that you could be born with this genetic makeup. Then you were raised, and you had actually no say in the way you were raised, you know, for a very long time, actually. And when you reached, you know, the point, if we switch to Kohlberg or somebody else, you know, like that, and you say, when you're 6, when you're 7, you're 7, I mean, you're not already all done, but you have been exposed to many experiences which you have not chosen, and those experiences were, you know, pressed upon a hardware, your genetic makeup, that you didn't choose either. And then, you know, there are all sorts of social influences that you have actually no say, you know, on how they work on you. So when you think about all of this and you say just dessert after this, you say, what kind of just dessert? I mean, when you take, when you pay attention to everything that can happen in a human life, you know, that is different from this idea, you know, of some spiritual decision maker, you know, such as in Kant or Hegel's philosophy, I think that there is so much, you know, to be said in favor of using these terms and explaining, you know, the traditional clientele of the criminal justice system are people who didn't get their due, you know, and now we are, you know, just abstracting from all the realities and say, but they did decide, you know, wrongly according to some standard in the end. So I don't know, don't you think that we can recover this? Because in a way, I think, you know, when you talk about stigma, affective blame, and how can we, you know, in your work with Hannah Pickard, how can we overcome, you know, this? I think this goes in the same way, you know, putting a lot more of care, you know, and care not only in the emotional sense, but also in the empirical sense, you know, paying attention to what circumstances actually may shape up the decisions of a human being at a given point in time.
That's really, again, a very, very well taken comment, Íñigo. And I think I do think that one can get into difficulty when one cedes too much of the language. And I certainly don't mean to give up on concepts like fairness, justice, respect, and so on. And very much so, I don't think I could articulate my position. And I'm also very much in favor of trying to, as it were, rework concepts where you can and not give them up. And in a way, that's what this was Hannah's phrase, not mine, but she talked in our paper on punishment and forgiveness in terms of reconceiving punishment in terms of a practice that is informed by aspirations to produce institutional counterparts to interpersonal forgiveness. And, but that also means getting away from the concept of forgiveness as an interpersonal and in some sense a sort of de haut en bas kind of thing. So I'm all for that. And in fact, this is sort of a bit anecdotal, but Manuel is very, very sweetly, he's on double duty because he's speaking at another book launch next year of some essays in English about my work, in which there's an essay by a former student of mine, John Gardner, whose work some of you may know, very, very well known legal philosopher who very sadly died of cancer a couple of years ago. And the first page, he's really nailed me, because the first page of his paper, it's about Hannah's and my work. And he basically just has this extended joke about, I used to really not believe in the concept of blame. And then I find myself using the word blame, and then I, be even more illogical because I blame myself for doing it. And then it sort of goes round in circles. And when my husband read this, he just roared with laughter. He said, well, you're the person who always says people work on what they find hardest. So you can go figure that. But I do think reclaiming concepts that we think have been built upon in ways that have been counterproductive, but that we need to, it comes back to the point you were making, Rocio, about, the imaginative scope. And you do too, Julieta, the sort of way in which refusing the boundaries, the conventional borders, opens up a new sort of imaginative terrain. Mm-hmm. Sorry, that was a bit...
That was great. Actually, again, if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free. If not, I do have another question. And it goes, back to your very last point, and so it also goes back to Rocio. Right now, we are being pressured, to, so to say, to grow up and become social scientists. No more the black letter of the law lawyers. So we hear a lot, by our institutions, the ones which have access to the funds, so the ones we have to talk to in order to be able to do our own research. And they are always talking about interdisciplinarity, multidisciplinarity. They are not very well defined, and I don't think that they really see the difference between them, but that may be even good, because you can treat them better. But my point is, in the last years, I have been, pushing for a more empirical approach to the criminal law for years, for decades, because, today I'm getting my first shot, so that means I'm approaching 50. And now I see that there is a lot of empirical work being done in at least in Spain and also in Latin America. But in my opinion, I don't know whether the question is whether do you think that this is the same in the Anglo-American world? I think that most of it is very unimportant, because it is very precise in measuring very unimportant things. So I see a lot of method going on. I see that a lot of people have, that they know that their SPSS, this is the old thing now, and they use, more modern things now. But I go back and look at Howard Becker, and I look back, at what, critical criminologists were, trying to do in the 60s, 70s, and it did have meaning and sense, and right now I see a lot of people, researching what people thought in Twitter right after the Charlie Hebdo, and wow, what a surprise! People were outraged. Oh my God! I mean, that is such a surprise, and we can, do so many interesting things, with that knowledge. So, what is your take on this?
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that we've got more empirical work, or we've got more people doing empirical work, but it tends to be very small scale, not big picture. And I think that's partly, ironically, as a result of a sort of, upswing in taking methodology seriously, which is partly shaped by a greater openness to multi and interdisciplinarity, but which, again, it can just close things down, and something you can't prove to to the standards of the natural sciences which most social scientists seem to think to be much more closed and sort of narrow than they really are, because they have lots of unanswerable questions too. But, you know, there's a sort of unrealism about what counts as persuasive, if not causal, evidence. So I agree that, and I also think, to be honest, I mean, I'm being a bit confessional here, but one of the reasons I haven't done quite so much feminist work in recent years is that sometimes I think that the methodology then becomes sort of theory, and then I've got, you know, I'm sure like all of us, I've got a certain taste for reading theory, and I'll read any amount of theory if I can see why I need to read it. But sometimes I think theory becomes almost like a thing in its own, a sort of end in itself. And I think that some of the really imaginative theorists like Foucault have actually generated some not such great work, because those tools are not necessarily always used with discretion. I mean, I think Foucault has prompted some fabulous work, don't get me wrong, but I think, so I don't think things are, the opening up has always produced ideal scholarship, no.
Very enlightening, thank you. Again, you know, last chance for anybody with a question, otherwise I will we are basically running out of time now, but I have one, I think it's a very easy question. Looking back at your work, you know, I get the impression that you were always one step ahead. You know, you always, you know, knew what was coming in terms of really interesting topics, you know, and you got there first in many occasions. And so, you know, if I am right, you know, I'm guessing that you still have this gift. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think that you're going in the next year, so that we can all jump, you know, with you and be ready for the future?
I wish I knew. I've been feeling quite pessimistic about the world recently, and I think that's not good for creativity. That's the honest answer. I think I'm going to write another piece about the resurgence of character in practices of criminalization, which worries me a lot. And it'll probably be a more normative piece than my book was. So that's where I'm going to go next, I think. But I don't have another big picture. I mean, I think Hannah and I will try to put our essays together and move them forward a bit. And when things have settled down after the pandemic and we can have a better sense of what's happening in America, I think David and I will do some more work on our project as well. But it'll be character-based criminalization that probably is my next big paper.
Great. Well, just to let you know, the next book that by you in Spanish will be edited possibly by Rocio and by Julieta. I see them. I see it in their eyes. They got it on them, you know, and it will be better done than, you know, Alejandro and I. I have to say, you know, and this is in closing, it's been a real pleasure, you know, to work with everybody. The translators did a great job. Alejandro and I reviewed the translations, all of them, but I have a rather big experience. This is my 13th edited book, either from English or the German, and you know, some of the translations I haven't reviewed. Sometimes I have just, you know, remade them, you know, from the ground up. And in this case, that wasn't the case. They were very, very solid translations. Everybody did a great job. I think they really liked your work, you know, and they put a lot of effort and a lot of talent in it. Thanks to you, Nicola, obviously, you know, for letting us do this, and thanks to Alejandro. Yesterday we were talking. I said, I will thank you, you know, for having the idea of putting this book together. And he said, you had the idea. I was, I don't know. So I think that pretty much tells you know why it is so easy to work with Alejandro. He just forgets, you know, things. So, you know, everything bad that I have done to him, he just keeps forgetting. I remember everything. That's why I'm so short, you know, with him. But, you know, he's such a great person. And I think, you know, if you get the big picture, I think, you know, that it is better to work, you know, it is better to live like Alejandro, forgetting things, and not like me. Well, thank you. I think it was Alejandro's idea, but I really jumped onto it, you know, and it's been my pleasure, you know, having this book published. I think, as all other people have said, you know, with with less of an interest or a self-interest into it. I think it's a great book that we owe to you and to the translators who have done a great job. So I'll give you the very last word, Nicola, and then we'll head off unless Alejandro, as the main host, wants to say something. No, then it's on you, Nicola. Thank you.
Well, I think that it's very obvious what the last word is going to be, and that's thank you. I mean, this has been a wonderful session. It's been an absolute delight to meet you all, to see you, Alejandro and Manuel, once again. And, I've just really enjoyed the discussion. I've learned a lot, and please let's stay in touch. But thank you again.
Thanks to you, Nicola.
Thank you, everybody. We off.
Thank you.
Great. Where's